Hello and welcome to GOMA. I'm Paul Barclay from Big Ideas on ABC RN in Brisbane. It's a pleasure to be here to host the latest in our GOMA Talks series. Tonight we're discussing toxic masculinity. The discussion is being held in conjunction with Quilty, an exhibition of the work of one of our leading contemporary artists, Ben Quilty. Do make sure to get along before it ends if you haven't already. He's a fantastic artist with much to say about the topic we're talking about tonight. Before I proceed any further, let me say that the Queensland Art Gallery and the Gallery of Modern Art stand in an important place originally occupied by the Turrbal and Jagera peoples. The gallery proudly recognises them as traditional owners of this site, and we respectfully acknowledge their elders past, present and future. The expression toxic masculinity entered the modern lexicon only recently and refers to some traditional male cultural norms that are considered undesirable or toxic. Everything from, say, a reluctance to show emotion or display any type of behaviour that could be seen as feminine, quote unquote, all the way through to misogyny, sexism, homophobia and violence, including sexual assault and family violence. The term does not mean that masculinity or men are toxic per se. Toxic masculinity is harmful to men and women and society generally, but some feel that the term itself is not especially helpful. We'll discuss this as well as the cost of toxic masculine behaviour, how it impacts on domestic violence and mental health, and how we bring about cultural change. These GOMA Talks sessions are presented in partnership between QAGOMA and ABC RN. Tonight is being recorded for my show Big Ideas on RN. It will be broadcast and podcast in the weeks to come. Don't forget, and this is important, GOMA Talks is interactive. You can take part in the discussion if you're here in the audience or if you're watching the webcast via the QAGOMA YouTube channel. You tweet your comments and questions to the hashtag GOMA Talks or SMS via 04888 Talks. That's 0488882557. I think it's easier, 04888 Talks, and I'll read some of them out. Please be concise and don't be offensive, because if you are, you will not get a Guernsey tonight. Let me introduce you to our panel of experts tonight. On my immediate right is Michael Flood, Associate Professor at QUT and Co-Director of the Centre for Research on Men and Masculinities. On my immediate left, Joe Williams, a Wiradjuri man, mental health advocate, professional boxer and former rugby league player. On my far left, we have Tarang Chawla, an Indian-born Australian writer and activist. He founded the Not One More Niki campaign after his sister Nikki was murdered. And on my far right, which used to say nothing about her politics, is Catharine Lumby, Professor of Media at Macquarie University, author and journalist. Please make them all welcome. So, Michael, there's been some reluctance and some resistance to this term toxic masculinity, even by those who accept that there is a problem with some aspects of traditional masculine culture. What is meant by the term, and do you think it is a valuable expression?
Sure. Look, we have to start with the term masculinity. And the term masculinity really means a set of ideals about what it means to be a man, a set of messages about being a man, and a set of behaviours that are part of that. So the term toxic masculinity marks off one particular version of how to be a man, one particular version of manhood, and says there's a problem with it. And the problem with toxic masculinity is precisely its toxicity, that it's unhealthy for its bearers, it's unhealthy for the people, the men who conform to its ideals, and it's unhealthy or indeed oppressive or dangerous for those around them, for the women, children, and indeed men around them. So the typical qualities that are named are aggression, dominance, emotional stoicism and repression, kind of compulsive heterosexuality and proving yourself sexually, and a series of qualities like that.
Yeah. And the term itself, you think, helps us advance a debate around whether or not those aspects of traditional masculinity are helpful?
Look, I do. It's got some obvious advantages. One thing is it clearly says the problem is social. It says the problem is not one of biology or genetics or testosterone. The problem is the messages we give boys and men, the ways that we raise boys, the messages we give men through peer culture, through sport and so on. It also has the advantage that it says it's not all men, hashtag not all men. It's a problem of particular ways of being a man, and it opens up space for healthy or positive ways of being a man. And the fourth way in which it's useful is it's potentially a teaching tool. It's potentially a kind of language and a tool one could use in a workshop with boys in schools or in an awareness-raising campaign. And there are other tools out there as well, the man box, other language and so on. So I'm not wedded to it, but I'm certainly wedded to somehow raising boys and men's and indeed community awareness of the harms of the ways we often raise boys and men.
Catharine, you're a lifelong feminist. You've been writing about feminism and about gender issues for decades now. What do you think of this term, toxic masculinity? Do you think it's helpful?
Well, and I'm saying this in respectful disagreement with Michael, even though I'm accepting the substance of everything he just said.
We're already disagreeing, okay.
No, the only area I would disagree with you on is how people might hear the term toxic masculinity. And look, I know this is totally anecdotal, but I tested this out on, I have two teenage sons, 17 and 19, and I've run this term by the older one and his friends at various times. They hear it as a label. I hear what you're saying, that it's a useful way of framing a particular kind of masculinity.
It may be.
Yeah. But unfortunately, I think, to use an analogy, and I'd be interested to know what Joe thinks about this, if we think about there's no doubt Australia has a deeply racist element and streak and unconscious bias and unconscious racism and conscious racism. There are so many things we need to get our house in order about. But as soon as you label someone racist, I think you close the conversation down. And I think, to me, what's interesting, if we're talking about opening conversations up about damaging masculine behaviour, which, as you point out, damage men as much as women and children, I think we've got to find a way of moving to a ground where you're asking questions. Why do you think like that? That's interesting you would say that. Why would you say that? That, to me, seems more helpful than defaulting to labels.
It's an accusation, racism, and
it can be heard that way.
It's almost an accusation, toxic masculinity as well, or I should say, is heard as such by some people.
It's heard as such. Now, I mean, I don't think we should let people off the hook for racist attitudes and behaviours, or let them off the hook for toxic masculine behaviours and attitudes. But I guess what I'm looking at is strategically, in a public sphere in which there's a lot of shouting and a lot of polemic and a lot of people go off to their corners and go to personal insult, how do we open that conversation up? That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, look, we're not going to get too bogged down in the definition, but Joe, what are your thoughts about whether it's a useful way of opening up this discussion about some traditional masculine traits that are undesirable, perhaps?
I only heard it in the last 12 months. So I'm someone who was raised by a staunch as heck father.
Yeah.
Right, and someone who has spoken openly about some very vulnerable topics. It was tough to have those conversations with my dad because he was a staunch man, and I'm the opposite. I'm the opposite of that, and I guess a lot of what I do and a lot of what I speak about is about being vulnerable and about and that's okay.
Yeah.
Because when we shut off to emotions or we try and put on this facade, we're not really authentic to who we are. So for me, I've got three young boys that I say, when we're crying, I say, don't cry. I won't ever say that to my son. I won't ever silence my boys around that because I knew and I saw so much in the community I grew up in being silenced around that typical soft behaviour. I'm a soft man. And I played rugby league. Admittedly, I wasn't real tough at that, but then I was a boxer as well. So two very tough sports. But I'm a very sensitive person.
Have you always been like that? Do you
always.
think? Yeah.
I still cry in conversations when I hear sad songs, when I hear, like sad movies and stuff like that. Like the people in my household like look at me and like, oh, here he goes again. I'm open to that because again, I won't ever silence people's emotions because we've all got them. We're all born with them. So why on earth we try and silence them or hide them to try and put up a facade of what we are or what we should be because of how society views us?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not going to work like that.
Tarang, what do you think are some of the, if I can use the word, toxic male traits that we really should be most concerned about and seeking to change?
How much time do we have, Paul? I think they run across the gamut. You know, we've obviously addressed that toxic masculinity or toxic masculine behaviours are as damaging to men themselves as they can be to women and children. You know, and we need only look at the suicide rate, and in particular, as Joe knows all too well, the suicide rate in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. In terms of the behaviours, you know, I came to advocate in this space or on this issue following the murder of my sister Nikita in 2015. And, you know, if we look at men who commit violence against intimate partners, a lot of that is driven by behaviours that are grounded in themselves a wounded psyche, you know, aspects of fear and shame and guilt and jealousy and possession. These ideals that are in no way an inner manifestation of the outward self, you know, and I find that toxic masculinity can sometimes be a very limiting. It can sometimes be very limiting for men in particular. That it doesn't
disguising. You're suggesting,
yeah, and it doesn't enable men, you know, these social constructs, as Joe has touched on, and the others, to be able to be their rounded, true selves. And you know, and growing up as you know, someone from an Indian background, I was probably in the minority in my cultural community in that I had a father, and I still have a father, who's very emotionally in touch with himself. You know, and we were modelled on a gender equal household from a very young age, which was and still is in, you know, particularly South Asian communities, not the norm. And I think that's part of the broader conversation around toxic masculinity in terms of addressing it. What are the sorts of broader changes we need to make?
I suppose what I'm trying to get at here is the idea that there are some, what we might define as traditional masculine behaviours that are perhaps not toxic but are still nonetheless. So I'm thinking about alpha males, people who are socially dominant and competitive. They may play sport. They may be the kind of people that Joe was playing rugby league with. They might, you know, work out at the gym, want to be strong. You can be alpha without being toxic, right? Do you think?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
Can
I think
comment on
that.
Yeah.
Just, I mean, part of the problem is that men are under pressure to show those qualities all the time. So a classic one is bravery. Bravery is great if you're trying to rescue someone from a burning building. That's just what you need. You need
What if the
bravery.
building's not burning?
Sorry?
What if the building's not burning?
Indeed. Well, so bravery is great for getting into the building, pulling someone out, but then afterwards, when you're comforting them and, you know, their dog's died or whatever, you need different qualities. You need compassion and empathy and so on. So one problem is an expectation that men show those qualities all the time. The other problem is that some of those qualities, such as aggressiveness, such as kind of compulsive heterosexuality, such as dominance, in themselves they're unhealthy. And so, you know, I think part of the task is to kind of open up the ways in which we allow men to be men. And I don't want to emphasise too much the harms to men themselves, because for me, a key problem here is what then men do with that in terms of harming women, as Tarang's described, but also harming other men. And, you know, there's really good evidence that the higher that men conform to kind of models of toxic or traditional or patriarchal masculinity, whatever you want to call it, the more likely they are to use violence against women, the more likely they are to use violence against other men, the more likely they are to consider suicide, to have crappy friendships, to not be involved in fathering and so on. So there's a whole lot of costs, not just for men, but for women and children that come with this.
Can I add to that, Paul?
Sure, yeah, sure.
So I'd like to flip the alpha male thing. I always like doing the gender flip. What does an alpha female look like? I mean, one of the problems that we're conjuring here with is a highly gendered society.
Yeah.
You know, and if we didn't have a highly gendered society, then we wouldn't have this kind of pole of masculinity against which everything else is judged, essentially. So that's why I come back to this idea of addressing, well, I mean, I would call it patriarchy, equality. That's one way of putting it. So that makes some people freak out, but I think we do live in a patriarchal society still. Highly gendered society might be a better way of putting it. But if we can start breaking down this idea that gender is so essential, that it's one of the first things we notice about people, and understand that if we talk about strong men, sometimes in women the same qualities are seen as being shrill or, well, I'm allowed to say the B word, a bitch, yeah? You know, so in other words, we code behaviours differently according to gender, and I think if we can get more conversations going around that, then we can open things up for masculinity and femininity.
So a few tweets that are coming through that are worth mentioning. Would it be worthwhile to utilise a term like healthy masculinity? That's a comment. The question of how can men better themselves is an accusatory statement. It's more a conversation about how society can change. And this final comment, women are punished for showing vulnerability too. Let's not kid ourselves. Oh, and punished for not showing emotion. So I think going to the comment that you were making there, Catherine, about the kind of hypocrisy that surrounds a lot of this gender-based conversation. And
I like that term healthy masculinity because it's putting a positive spin on it. Rather than talking about the negative, if we could start talking about healthy masculinity and what that, you know, what that looks like and what it doesn't look like. So that we're starting from a place of enabling, I guess.
Yeah. So Joe, you know, spending as much time as you did in sporting clubs, in competitive professional sport, you know, bonding with other male sports men, I suppose heavy drinking, partying, drug taking, all of which you used to partake in but don't anymore, that was all part and parcel of kind of male culture as you lived it, really, was it?
Yeah, I think it's a part of society culture. You know, we look at it as if, I get asked this question all the time, does sport or rugby league have a problem with their culture? I say no, the country has a problem with its culture. And when we get back to the conversation of what it's like to be a man, or what should it look like to be a man, what it should look like to be a man is a certain part of genitalia. That's it. Not your behaviours of what you do or how you act or how you try and walk and talk with vibrato. You know, for me, I'm not... it's no secret that I'm extremely vulnerable in a lot of conversations I have with people, because I realise as well in a lot of the work that I do in community, it's that hurt people. Right? So when we're looking at this, the toxic masculinity or the over-aggressive status of a lot of, or some men in particular communities, I look at why. I don't judge for what it is. I say, what's going on for that behaviour to happen? And, you know, 9 times out of 10, you trace it back to childhood trauma. And again, hurt and vulnerability in those situations that increase. And what we know about childhood trauma now, it changes. All the studies around childhood trauma talks to it changes the physiology of our brain. It can develop physical illnesses, can develop mental illnesses, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
So the thing that we're not talking about enough in our communities is childhood trauma. And again, that goes back to hurting people. People are born with trauma and they're perpetrating it onto their family members.
Well, there's a lot, as you say, there's a lot of research on this and on epigenetics. And for Indigenous people, of course, we're talking about
born with it.
Intergenerational trauma.
We're born with it. You know, we've got kids in community that are born with trauma that dates back to colonisation.
Yeah.
And again, you know, when we look at the female body and the makeup, we've got a female and we've got 3 generations sitting within that female. We've got, again, I'm not great with medical terminology, but we've got a female, then we've got eggs, okay? And then we've got those eggs have eggs as well. So that's 3 generations that can be impacted through trauma that is then born within children that we're carrying when we're born.
Tarang, you mentioned before you're a campaigner these days against male violence, and you came to this as a result of a terrible family tragedy. As you say, your sister was murdered by her partner. I wonder whether you could just briefly tell us about that story, and then what you've learnt since about the relationship between violence and how our culture treats or mistreats women, and how male culture is a part of that.
I woke up on Friday the 9th of January with a knock on the door from 2 Victoria police officers. I live in Melbourne, and they came to tell my family and I that Nikita, my younger sister, had been murdered overnight by her partner. I didn't quite understand what they were telling me. It's that kind of thing where like the rug's been pulled out from under you. And the next thing I remember is going to the coroner's court to identify a dead body. And I grew up in the 1990s, you know, on a diet of Duke Nukem and other video games. And dead bodies in real life don't look like dead bodies in video games. But I remember that was probably the most important piece of paper I've ever signed in my life, which was identifying that the body lying lifeless corpse on a metal table was in fact my sister. And that spurred me to sort of understand more about the issue of men's violence. Victoria, where I'm from, held a Royal Commission into Family Violence in 2015. The recommendations were handed down in 2016, and the Victorian government committed to implementing all 227 of them. The one thing I've noticed that crosses across all boundaries of race, across all boundaries of class, across different typifications and ideologies of masculinity, whether those men exhibit what would be considered healthy masculine traits or toxic masculine traits. In the case of intimate partner violence, is that the men who commit violence view their intimate partner, their female intimate partner, as a chattel, some kind of possession, particularly where there's physical violence. You know, and that's why we see so commonly violence occurring in the context of separation. You know, we've seen, particularly post-rise of second-wave feminism, and seeing women have the agency after a very long time to no longer have to remain, particularly in the context of marriage, wedded to men for financial certainty. You know, and women leaving violent relationships are often in arguably one of the most dangerous phases of their life. You know, and the one characteristic, whether they're, you know, a man from, you know, we had a high-profile case of a former lawyer who murdered his partner in 2005 in Victoria, whether it's a man of that stature or it's, you know, a man who has other substance and other abuse issues, they view that individual as a possession.
Yeah, I think the other really important part of this, and you speak about this when you speak about witnessing the warning signs with your sister, is that we do rightly focus on physical violence and condemn physical violence, but are we perhaps too dismissive of controlling, coercive and abusive behaviour, which, as we know, is a red flag, but also just is unacceptable in its own right as well?
Absolutely. And I think one of the problems with it as well is that it starts so early with the way that we code boys to become, to grow into young men. So the idea of, you know, boys will be boys is so ingrained across, you know, ethno-cultural communities, where it becomes a thing of boys engaging in certain controlling behaviour and then that being excused, you know, even by the boy's mother or maternal aunts and things. So it's not as though this is just those who identify as men are purely advancing toxic ideas of masculinity. It is a whole of society issue in how we are raising boys to become men. And so a lot of those behaviours that the man who killed my sister exhibited, he had them well before he decided to take a meat cleaver and stab her 35 times. That was there, you know, whether it was... in fact, you know, in this age of technology, the act of checking someone else's phone without their consent, that's exactly what he did. Absolutely. Just prior to killing her.
Yeah.
You know, because he had caught wind that she had decided to leave, and so he checked her phone to look for proof. And that behaviour wasn't exactly just a spur of the moment. That controlling, possessive tendency, I think, is embodied very early in men.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, Paul, I'm sure we're going to get to this idea of talking about, well, what do we do? What are the solutions?
Yeah.
And starting young is one of them. But you may want to kind of broaden the discussion at this point. I mean, or do you want to talk about that now?
Yeah, just one of the things I wanted to talk about, and we'll do that because I think it's time to talk about that. But Michael, before I do that, I just wanted to talk about, there has been a recent study actually looking at young men who conform to what we understand as traditional ideas of manhood, and it's found that they are more likely to suffer harm to themselves and do harm to others. Just tell us about that study, because it does look actually and asks questions that is around the very issues that we're talking about here, and what that study found.
Sure. So this was a study by Jesuit Social Services, part of something called the Men's Project, and they surveyed 1,000 young men in Australia, 18 to 25, a nationally representative survey, and asked them about. They gave them 17 statements, and the 17 statements they called the man box, and these were 17 statements about being a man. A real man always has lots of sex with women. A real man is never gay. A sort of series of statements that really were about kind of stereotypical or traditional masculinity. And they asked these young men whether they thought these were the messages they got from society. And then they asked these young men, did they themselves agree with these messages? And the young men who themselves agreed with these messages also were more likely to, for example, have thought about suicide. They were 6 times as likely to have thought about suicide in the last 3 months as men who didn't conform to those messages. And what's going on there is, if you believe that men should be tough, men should be stoic, men shouldn't ask for help, then when you do suffer, and all of us suffer at different times, you're less likely to ask for help. You're more isolated. This study also found that the young men who conformed more strongly to those ideals also had shallower friendships. They had a smaller number of people they could turn to talk to about problems. So their own health was poor in some ways, but they were also more likely to have sexually harassed a woman in the last 6 months. They were more likely to have been involved in violence as perpetrators against other men, and also as victims. And this was not surprising at all, in fact, because there are literally hundreds of studies now that show that conformity to traditional masculinity shapes men's behaviour. It's not the only story, it's not the only thing that shapes whether it's intimate partner homicide or suicidal behaviour or fathering or anything else, but gender, and in particular masculinity, is a key part of what shapes men's behaviour. We had a couple of questions come through about trans and queer men and the extent to which
very important.
Toxic masculinity is an issue for trans and queer men. And I'd say that what we're talking about here is about social norms, about social patterns. And if you're, for example, someone who now you live as a man, you identify as a man, and you're treated as a man by those around you, then just like me, you will be invited into sexism in everyday ways by your peers, by your culture. And you will be given certain kinds of unearned privilege that you wouldn't have got if you're perceived as female. So, for example, speak up at a meeting and your voice will be listened to more readily than a woman's. Send in a CV with a male name and it will be seen as more competent than the same CV with a female name. So partly what we're talking about here is about cultural patterns. And
that's everyday sexism, isn't it?
It is. It's patterns of privilege.
Interestingly, Julie Bishop, who has also said that she is no feminist, talked about her contributions in cabinet meetings of the government where she would say something forcefully and it would just sink without a trace, and then she'd find some bloke in cabinet saying almost the same thing 5 minutes later, and everyone nodding furiously in agreement.
There's a great New Yorker cartoon of 4 guys sitting around a boardroom table and 1 woman, and the chair of the board says, "That's an excellent suggestion, Miss Smith. Perhaps one of the men would like to make it." But can I just say very briefly too, I mean, what Michael just said is perceptive. And look, as a woman, in my 50s, who happens to be a professor, and that in no way defines who I am as a person, but that's my title. And I had this experience a couple of years ago. I walked into a meeting, I was on a promotions committee, and there was sort of, everyone else was man, and 2 of the guys I knew, 2 male professors, and there were a couple of male professors I didn't know. And as I walked in, I was probably dressed a bit like this, in a floaty frock, and one of the guys who didn't know me looked up and went, "Oh, I'll have a macchiato." And this, well, it's okay. I just went, "Sure, anyone else want a coffee?"
Yeah.
Because being a professor doesn't stop me buying coffee for people. But it's interesting, it's sort of written on the body. I'm not what a professor's supposed to look like.
So really the point is then, how do we engage men in discussion around the need to change these behaviours, and how do we go about driving deep and lasting cultural change among men? How do we do this, Catherine?
Well, look, I'll kick off with my expertise, but then there's other people on the panel.
We'll bring the others in on this.
So 2 things I've done. I was sharing with Joe, I think he knows this anyway. I've been working with the National Rugby rugby league since 2004, so it's a very long time. And I've done 3 large research projects, whole of culture, all of the players, surveys, and also interviews with players, looking at what are the behaviours, attitudes and behaviours in off-field behaviour, right? And also looking at the clubs and top-down, bottom-up stuff. And on the basis of that, I've worked with other people to design education programs. Now, one of the things about education programs, to echo what Joe said, we're dealing with whole of society problems. You've got a cohort of young men, but just because they're coded as working class and it's body contact sport does not make them particularly toxic, if we're going to use that term. But so how do you engage them? Well, you don't go in and stand up in front of them and lecture them and give them a list of do's and don'ts and imply that they're all bad guys. What you do is, using the research, design hypothetical scenarios which have grey areas in them and sometimes sharp-ended legal areas, and get them involved. And they start to see they've got a range of values about how they're going to treat other individuals in these scenarios. And the final thing I'll say is I've done research in Australian New South Wales high schools on 13 to 17-year-olds, boys and girls. And what's very, very interesting, it reflects what you were saying about that study, was that you'll find that a lot of young men will say to you, well, I don't agree with this, but the message society gives us is. So what you find is there's a lot of dissonance with that message, and that's something we can start working with really young.
Yeah. Look, I know, Michael, that you've done a lot of research on this. I will come to you in a minute, but I just thought I'd get a response from you, Joe, because as you kind of were suggesting when you were talking about your dad, a lot of men are staunch. It's a kind of harden up if you're feeling emotionally a bit fragile or a bit vulnerable. Some men have a very strong sense of what masculinity means and how they should project it. You travel around talking to men about these issues and their relationship to mental health and so on. How do you engage them? How do you get them to open their mind to thinking about this and perhaps questioning some of their own behaviours?
Again, I think it's conversation, exactly what you said, like put in some scenarios and question them. And I guess invite that safe space first and have the discussion. Well, there's going to be no judgments here, so let's have a discussion and look at how we can work through this. But when it comes to, I think the toughen up type, pull your socks up type attitudes, I think we're looking at an older class of men, and in the work that I do, I'm definitely seeing a change in that, and again, as I'll harp on it all day, it's about hurt people and childhood trauma contribute a lot to this, and the lack of male role models in life and households and so forth as well. So again, it's just I open the conversation, facilitate a conversation, and again around no judgments, because we'll find that a lot of these young people that are in this situation that are too scared to even talk about it in their own home because there might be a dad or an uncle that have those views, are scared of judgment. So it's opening that safe space to say, look, we're not going to judge you here, but how do you feel around these type of situations?
So you're suggesting then that for younger men, the stigma of admitting that they're not coping, that they're feeling depressed, anxious, dealing with emotional turmoil, that stigma for younger men, you do think, is dissipating and they're feeling more like they can talk about it, seek help and so on?
Well, everyone's got social media. We see it. People that's reaching out for help every day now. And I've got to say that with stigma isn't about what people think. Stigma is about what goes on inside your own head.
Yes.
If in reality, with my suicide attempt in 2012, I could have picked up my phone and called 200 people and told them I wasn't well and I think I'm going to end my life. I ring my mum, I ring my kids, they run to my help, in an instant. But it's our head that convinces us otherwise. That's what stigma is.
Yeah.
We brandy this word around, is that there's a stigma in community. No, the stigma's not in community, because in reality, if you ask each other, do you care about your loved ones? Of course you do. It's just that we're coming out of a period of judgment, and those judgment happens with those older people. We're now, again, with education and so forth around these topics, and this is where we're moving forward as a country. I had a conversation with my dad, and I ain't afraid to say it. He says, how do you think it makes us feel? You go out talking around this stuff and you say that you've got voices in your head and all sorts of stuff's going on for you mentally. How do you think that makes us feel? People are going to think that we're a bad parent. And I said, Dad, where do you think I got it from? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, it's genetic. Again, all the research around the world now proves this. Typical dad says, well, it's probably your mother, not me. But again, that opened up a conversation with myself and my dad. Now, my dad, staunch as heck, as I said, would stand here and fight tooth and nail because he never had a dad, and all he had to do was protect his mum growing up and his sisters, right? So for me to have the conversation when he first reached out to me and he said, Joe, I was told that you attempted your life last night. I need you to tell me the truth. Did you try and end your life? And I said, yes, Dad, I did. And that was the day we bonded as men. Because I was vulnerable in the face of all my fears. And my biggest fear was being able to talk that way to my dad. And he sat there and he cried like a little baby too.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And that broke that barrier with us, and we bonded then in that instant, and he's been my best mate ever since.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, it opened a door.
It opened a doorway for conversation.
No.
And that's all it takes in these tough times, especially around the topics that I talk about, is to have that initial conversation. Show vulnerability and show that vulnerability is okay, because we're all born with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, very well said, Joe. Tarang, I suppose I worry about the fact that we're talking a lot at the moment about this issue of intimate partner violence and domestic violence. We've had royal commissions into family violence. We've had new laws introduced. Political leaders are speaking out about it. We've had books that are written about it, advertising campaigns. The media's on the case. We're doing stories about this. Yet the rate of violence continues. We read about disturbing instances of women being killed by men and domestic violence in the papers all too frequently. 1 death a week, I think, is the statistic. It's shocking, and one wonders what it will take to change. What are your thoughts then about what's needed to change the behaviour of men to stop this epidemic of violence?
Well, last week we had 2 women killed. The week prior we also had at least 2 women killed. So, in the last fortnight, at least 4 Australian women have been killed, all by men known to them. Now, it's a really tricky question to answer. We've got, and I'm an Our Watch ambassador and a White Ribbon ambassador, and Our Watch, in particular, is very strong in promoting gender equality, which will have a measurable impact in terms of the rates of violence, but it doesn't get to everything. Jess Hill wrote a fantastic book, See What You Made Me Do, and discusses the idea of what drives perpetrator behaviour. And there's a lot that needs to happen in the here and now to protect women and children. When it comes to funding for community legal centres, it comes to providing safe refuges for women, and it comes down, in my view, to political leadership. I've written to Prime Minister Scott Morrison several times around the issue, still awaiting a response.
It's in America.
He is now. He is eating a very nice meal, but with President Trump. But I've written to him a number of times about the issue, because we're going down a very dangerous path. For example, with mandating counselling for women fleeing abusive relationships, knowing full well that that's exposing them to undue risk of physical violence.
And can I add to Tarang, what you just said is so important, because we're dealing with the gendered structure, but we're also dealing with a whole lot of, components of the justice system and the political system that need to be dealt with. And I think one of the things to add to what you're saying is I think we need special courts for sexual assault and domestic violence. There are very particular issues there. So there's a whole lot of structural reforms that can be made to the judicial system.
I think that's true, Catherine, and I think that they are being rolled out to some extent already. However, the problem is courts deal with crimes that have already been committed. Community legal services deal with crimes that are already committed. Refuges are for women who've already been abused by men. What I'm getting at is, how do we stop the behaviour in the first place? Michael?
Yep. Look,
some thoughts?
I mean, to actually seriously prevent domestic and sexual violence, which we've been focused on a bit tonight, we do need culture change, and part of the culture change we need is in ideals of masculinity and norms of masculinity. So I want to bring it back to that. There've been some questions coming through on the feed about what can we actually do, and there are actually some very good work going on in Australia. So one thing is parents can play a role. Parents can play a role in terms of how they raise their sons, and lots of parents are thinking about how they raise their daughters, but we need to do that same kind of critical awareness of gender when it comes to sons. And there are organisations like the Full Stop Foundation putting out very good kind of fact sheets on how to talk to your sons about consent, how to talk about respect. Likewise, there is good face-to-face education going on in Australia and other places that gets boys talking and gets men talking, something like Catharine described. And certainly one key strategy is using face-to-face education, but also online strategies to get boys and men talking about what it means to be a man, and to kind of raise a kind of more critical awareness of some of the narrow and dangerous messages about being a man that many of us grow up with. But we also have to scale up. We have to scale up. And so I know that Our Watch, the National Violence Prevention Foundation, it's been running a campaign called Never Follow. And Never Follow is aimed at young men on social media, and it's trying to invite young men to resist, again, kind of blind conformity to sexist masculinity. Yeah. So in terms of addressing the serious problems that we've been talking about, part of the long-term work we need to do is culture change work, and whether it's through face-to-face education or social marketing or indeed policy change, I think we can start to shift, for want of a better term, toxic masculinity.
I mean, this is very important, isn't it? I mean, this is actually the crucial step, and, some people might say that, it's trivial getting young men to stop laughing at sexist jokes or engaging in so-called locker room
Sure,
banter.
And it's only trivial if you don't care about them raping.
Yeah.
I think. If you actually care about sexual violence or domestic violence, then one thing you have to shift is the kind of peer support that means that a minority of men go, oh yeah, everyone around me thinks that's funny. Everyone around me thinks that some women do ask to be raped, that some women do bring it on themselves. He's in a minority, but if everyone laughs along and no one says anything, he will continue to think that, and he will be enabled by that behaviour. Been some great questions in here about what does the alternative look like? What does a healthy masculinity look like? Or what language do we use? And some of the phrases I've seen out there are democratic manhood, or feminist manhood, or positive manhood, or just men. There's all kinds of language out there. But two questions that were raised on the feed. One was, let's make sure that we don't vilify working class men and Indigenous men and the kind of men who aren't the kind of white privileged men like me.
Absolutely.
That's a really key issue. A second issue is whatever vision of masculinity we offer to boys and men, it has to be diverse. It has to be multiple. We can't just substitute one man box for another man box. It has to celebrate qualities while allowing that they're available to women as well. If we say, to be a man means X, Y, and Z, and because that's about manhood, women can't do it, well, that's kind of not very helpful. But the bottom line is, I think our visions of a desirable or healthy masculinity have to be egalitarian, have to be based on respect, on equality, and so on.
And look, just coming back to the trans thing and the queer thing, I think one of the things that gives me hope, and I am an optimist just by nature, born that way, is that we are now starting to really, as a society, begin to grapple with gender fluidity, with trans identity. The community came together and said same-sex marriage is a positive thing and it's a human right. So I think that some of those...
And non-binary ideas of gender
Non-binary ideas of gender. And I think that those things also feed into the possibility of having these discussions. Yep. And I don't think that sort of discussion could have been had even 10 years ago. Now, I know there's a long way to go, and there's a lot of transphobia and there's still a lot of homophobia, but nonetheless, I think that those changes in society are going to feed into these conversations and be helpful?
I think, I'll take myself back and I'll correct myself in something I said earlier. It was around the only way that we should be looked at or judged is because of our genitalia. Well, that's not right as well. And I'll pull myself up on that because I was incorrect in saying that. And the fact that we need more empathy and respect around individuals' choices or how they see themselves. That's what, again, it's around respect, and we just don't have. We have not enough empathy and too much judgment in community, and that's what we need. We need more empathy, more love and respect when it comes to that sort of stuff. Because what I think of someone else is none of my business. What someone or how they choose to be or how they feel is completely on them, and I've got to respect that.
Well said.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more, and I think there's bits of... We started this conversation with the idea of toxic masculinity as a label, and I think one of the important things in terms of unpacking the concept of toxic masculinity and certainly addressing the behaviours across society is, particularly everybody that's here, everybody that's watching the live stream, those who listen to it afterwards, myself included, is this idea that we intrinsically, particularly those who identify as men, are not immune from toxic behaviours. Like just because, for example, Joe and I and Michael and Catherine and Paul are on a panel about toxic masculinity doesn't mean that, you and I won't necessarily exhibit behaviours that are at some point toxic. And so having creating the peer relations within men, particularly to be able to, I'm not a big fan of the term, but call out that behaviour, to be able to address it holistically, and systemically. So it's like, we have some friends of mine, close friends of mine and we have this thing where, if we say something, we'll stop ourselves in our tracks and actually just say, hey bro, that's wrong. Toxic.
That's wrong.
We actually just say toxic. Bro, that's toxic.
I'm a massive believer in the saying, what we ignore is what we accept.
What you walk past.
Exactly.
And it becomes okay. It becomes okay to do that because it's not an affront on the person's character. It's not a slight on their reputation. In fact, it's actually an aspirational thing to create a masculinity, embody a masculinity that is better.
This is exactly what you actually did, Tarang, on Q&A all of those years ago after Eddie Maguire had cracked a joke about drowning Caroline Wilson, the football journalist from Victoria, and Sam Newman jumped in and supported Eddie. And a lot of people were saying, oh, look, it was just a joke, what's everybody getting carried away about? And the point that you made on that program was that exactly that. I mean, what we ignore, even if they're just words, are attitudes about what we accept.
It was July 2016. I think the first time I was ever on national television, my heart was like beating out of my chest, and it was like Q&A like 10:37, just as Tony's about to call stumps on that Monday night, and they said we've got time for one last question, and I remember asking about what role does the media play in normalising attitudes that condone or perpetuate violence against women, as it relates to masculinity. And journalist Van Batten was on the panel and others, and all the panellists, with the exception of Mr. Steve Price, were able to give a reasoned, nuanced answer. And Mr. Price's first response was, oh yeah, they're friends of mine and they're pretty good blokes. Yeah. And I thought that was really strange. You can go back and watch it on YouTube. It's still there. But it was such a strange thing that somebody had just asked a question about what are we going to do about the way the media is talking about men's violence. Well, this is, and the statistics we talked about tonight, they were still there a few years ago. But it's this masculinity, this behaviour is, it's protected by friendship groups and structures.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
A really powerful point there, I think, because, there's that phrase, you can't be what you can't see. And one of the research projects I'm working on at the moment is looking at free-to-air commercial news and current affairs TV, right, and looking at cultural diversity. So our focus is on, on the kind of white wall, which is, free-to-air commercial TV. But at the same time, what you find is the dominance, and I'll just call it out and name it, the dominance of white men in terms of running commercial media, in terms of presenting on talkback radio, in terms of the dominance they have in a lot of television shows. I'm not saying they're all toxic, but there's certainly, I mean, look at Alan Jones and what's happening with advertisers there, you know, saying that, you know, Morrison should, shove a sock down Jacinta Ardern's throat.
Faced a huge backlash, actually.
He has
that
faced
comment.
a huge backlash, and this is where social media, I think, is a game changer. But
It's giving people a voice.
yeah, I mean, the thing is that is the default setting in a lot of media still, traditional, or what I like to call vintage media, because I think it's on the way out.
We've got some good tweets coming through. The gender binary is so 18th century. We all embody both the feminine and the masculine poles. We ain't ones and zeros, people.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah.
So we were talking about, you know, what we want to encourage. So we, you know, I think there's agreement. There's a problem with the messages we give boys and men and those who live as boys and men about being a man, and there's, you know, that plays itself out in harm. So we need some kind of alternative to that, and people are talking about healthy masculinity. Two things there. One is that some people say, oh, you know, the phrase toxic masculinity generates pushback and resistance. It's going to make men defensive. I'm fine with using some other language, but I want to make the point that any kind of criticism of sexism, of gender inequalities will generate some resistance, some backlash. And if there's no pushback, no resistance whatsoever, you're probably not actually making change.
Well, so
we have to live with that.
We've seen that come from Me Too as well, actually, that response.
Indeed. And so on healthy masculinity itself, I think part of the project is actually to encourage boys and men to care less about being men, to actually disinvest in manhood or masculinity. So yes, I want to foster positive visions of a healthy masculinity or something like that. I also want to foster positive visions of selfhood, of just, you know, good ways of being in the world. Because part of the problem is boys and men's kind of desperate and obsessive investment in being perceived as real men. That's part of the problem. And so breaking down gender in the way that Catharine described, and a kind of gender boundaries and gender hierarchies, should be part of this work.
I want to go to where some of the resistance to this is coming from, Catharine. It's said that toxic masculinity and misogyny is inseparable from patriarchy and male power, and I'm sure that that is true. But many men, especially blue-collar men, feel that they no longer occupy any position of power at all in the economy. They feel like they've been thrown onto the economic scrap heap. Manufacturing has declined, the factories have closed, heavy industry has completely screamed to a halt. The new jobs that are coming up in the tertiary service sector are disproportionately jobs that women are being employed in, partly because of the lack of emotional skills that a broader view of masculinity would actually allow men.
Communication.
That's right. So with men being these victims of globalisation and economic restructuring, how do we get these men who feel like they're victims themselves to accept the need to change what masculinity is all about?
Such an important question. I grew up in Newcastle. I was a kid in the 1960s in a working class town dominated by the BHP and the dockyards and coal mining. And I also saw and witnessed a lot of domestic violence. Luckily not in my primary family, but it was very common. So, you know, I think there's no question that for men from that background, there was an expectation of a certain dominance, and that masculinity was equated with having control and power and having a job for life. And there's been huge disenfranchisement. There's huge youth unemployment if you go to somewhere like West Wallsend, just outside of Newcastle. And what comes with that is often substance abuse, cycles of violence, a whole range of problems. But I think one of the big issues is getting political leadership around explaining what globalisation means. You know, unfortunately, we've got a kind of right-wing movement in politics at the moment where the default setting is about saying, well, look, you know, feminists have ruined society, yeah? And what did someone say? Yeah, that's a good one. It doesn't help me, I must say. But I think that we need leadership because what we're seeing is a male victimhood movement rising up. And that's a simplistic and reactive response. And I have some understanding of why some men may start saying, well, what's happened? Why has everything fallen apart? It must be the feminists. It must be the greenies. That, you know, in other words, looking for what's changing in society to blame, when in fact the forces are economic.
Yeah.
And this is something that needs to be addressed at the core and spoken about honestly by political leaders, because we live in a culture where a lot of politicians are dog whistling, and they're using immigration, or they're using race, or they're using feminism, or they're using all these sorts of things as a kind of blame game rather than actually explaining what's happening.
Yeah, I should say that what the audience was laughing at for the radio audience was the tweet. Sometimes being sensitive can be unattractive. My feminist partner admitted that she has been most attracted to me with a tool belt on.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, sure.
Not that I've claimed to wear a tool belt, tragically. But
join the club.
So you know, toxic masculinity, or you know, our ideas and practices of gender are sustained not only by men but by women. So of course, women too may be invested in traditional forms of masculinity, including forms of masculinity that aren't necessarily very good for them. They're certainly not as invested as men, though. So if you survey men and women about how should men be in the world, men tend to show much stronger endorsement of toxic or traditional masculinity than women do. But no doubt, you know, the way some women raise their sons, the way some women treat their male partners like this and so on, you know, shows that kind of investment. But for me, I think politically the priority is to work with men, to engage boys and men in, you know, shifting towards healthier ways of being in the world. But part of this work has to be speaking to women's investment in this.
I was going to say, with what Michael is saying, that particularly across you know, ethnicities and cultures, I think that there is, you know, particularly if you take a lot of South Asian, Middle Eastern and other communities, the mother plays a fundamental role, as mothers do in all cultures, but particularly in the raising of boys. You know, like the men are often, because they're the primary breadwinner, they're quite absent. You know, they're not hands-on. They are that idea of toxic masculinity, stoic, etc., emotionally reserved and tough. And so it's often from the mother that a lot of boys in certain cultural communities will learn this idea of what being a man means. And the idea of you know, that from they don't develop it from their father so much as from how that, you know, the father's behaviour is relayed to them by the mother. So the mother's almost like a messenger, you know, of this information.
And change comes from the younger generation. If we are to deal with this issue of toxic masculinity, the change is going to come from the younger men today. You speak to thousands of people, Tarang, at schools. You visit schools to talk about these issues. What sort of response are you getting from teenage high school boys to this kind of discussion? Are their minds open to rethinking their ideas of what it is to be a young man?
Absolutely. I think that we live in a culture, you know, where we look at younger people and we act in such a paternalistic way, in the way that we socialise them and the way that we view them, you know. And I think that, as Michael and others have touched on, the work has to happen, you know, with young men and with boys, and I see such optimism and such hope in these young men, because they see a future for themselves that is more expansive and less limiting. So it's not even about the idea of, you know, structural society and everything. It's just their idea of self and selfhood. One of the other panellists touched on their idea of who am I in this big, you know, expansive world, and what am I going to become, and who can I be? And so by challenging these ideals of toxic masculinity, you know, in their foundational stages, they're actually seeing a possibility of who they could be that is unlike previous generations, or the role models that they might have around them. And so there is confusion, there's fear, there's uncertainty, but there's also this quiet confidence, you know, and it's really exciting. And Joe, you talk to so many young people, and it's exciting seeing that you can almost see the wheels turning in their head. Like, I can be other things than what my dad might be or what my uncle might be, you know.
And I think,
if you can just add to that, Joe, and perhaps a final comment then from Catherine, and we will have to wrap it. But Joe, to you.
all around this topic, you know, it's why I think it's been a little bit foreign to me. As I said, I've only heard about it in the last sort of 12 to 18 months. Is because I grew up in a very respectful environment towards females, towards, you know, my mothers, my sisters, and females in my community. Because as an Aboriginal man, my belief and through my teachings, it's that when we are born, we are come from a mother. And when we die, we go back to our mother, as in our Mother Earth. And, you know, you look at the oldest civilization on the planet, you know, our people right here. In a lot of the communities I go to right around the country, it's a very matriarchal-based system. You know, it is. You know, I've sat in communities, and I speak strongly to my community. But there are communities and nations around the country where I've been in boardrooms, sitting with community, and all the men are at the front of the table, and they say, what should we do? And the men sit back and look over at the females, and the females give them the nod, and they go, yes, that's what we should do. Right? We have to start to have a look at the oldest continuing people of this world. Civilization of man started with our people, so we have to start to sit and listen and learn of how they've survived for so long.
Okay, a brief final comment.
Yeah, well said.
Thanks, Joe.
Very briefly, I want to say, as a mother of two sons, I've learned a lot about talking to boys from them. And one of the things I've learnt, they've instructed me. I remember taking them to a feminist art exhibition in Paris, thinking that I was kind of inducting them, and they were just horrified by all the vaginas in the paintings. And when we went back to the apartment, they were 8 and 10, one of them said, turn around and say hi to the viewers, Mum. And I said, what viewers? I was cleaning up. And they said, it's the Feminist Mum Show, and this episode's called Feminist Mum Cleans Up the Apartment. And so I think what I found with my sons was that being able to open up a dialogue, but also keep some humour in it and some humanity in it, I think that that's what's really important as well. It's not about lecturing, it's about listening and dialoguing.
Okay, that unfortunately is where we'll have to leave our discussion on toxic masculinity. Thanks very much to our terrific panel this evening. Thanks to QAGOMA. And thanks to you for coming along. Don't forget to check out the Ben Quilty exhibition here at the GOMA. It's terrific. He's a fantastic artist. The discussion that you've just heard will be available on Big Ideas on ABCRN in the weeks to come. Check out our Twitter feed to find out when, and also look out for our podcast. Thanks very much for coming. Good night.